Hi, my name is Leah Day, and welcome to this video for the Building Blocks Quilt Along. Today we're going to be stitching stippling an echo shell into one of our basket blocks. So let me show you what the design looks like before we get started. Okay, so here's our quilting design, and you can see we've got lots of echo shell and stippling coming together to make this really pretty. If you're looking for this guide so you can mark your blocks with this design, you can find it in the Building Blocks quilt pattern available at leahday.com. Okay, as for what I have marked my echo shell coming into this area, and I've definitely marked this handle. This handle's probably going to be a little tricky to stitch just because of all the layers of fabric going on there. The place that I haven't marked the stippling because this is easy enough to freehand quilt, and you might find that you can flow through the design easier if you don't mark it, if instead you stitch that freehand. Of course, if you've never stitched stippling before, having the marked lines might be nice because it will give you an idea of how to move through the block. So whether you stitch on the lines, if you mark the lines or not, this is definitely going to be a fun block to stitch. So let's get started. So I've already stitched the entire basket shape in the ditch, the perimeter and the handle. I have not stitched this inner triangle in the ditch, however. I'm not going to, because this echo shell design flows right out over that area, and I don't want any ditch lines kind of going on top of or beneath, just kind of conflicting with that design. It will definitely show up on the back of the quilt, and I don't like that, so I'm not going to ditch that. Instead, I'm just going to stitch right over it and pretend like it doesn't exist. I like doing that sometimes, it's kind of fun. So for the echo shell, all we do is simply travel stitch carefully along the stitch in the ditch, the ditching area, and then swing out along that marked line with your nice soft curve. Now it's definitely a good idea to do some rotating here. Curves like this can be tricky, particularly as it starts to get bigger and bigger, and it's a wider curve than the space that your hands can create comfortably. So I might start even rotating and making sure that I can really stitch that smoothly as I work it down the corner of my block. Of course, if you stitch off, don't worry about it. Those lines will be erased in the end. No one will be the wiser. As we work through this area to stitch over that triangle, you may find that those seam allowances give you a little trouble. Maybe rotate and see if you can kind of eliminate that issue. The reason why it can impact your quilting is that all those layers of bulk of seam allowance are getting underneath your foot in some way and stopping it from moving as smoothly. That's all it is. So sometimes rotating your block around will help. Now this is going to be the trickiest spot, and I'm going to go very slowly. I'm going to take very careful stitches as I work my way out and down that ring. The reason is that particular line, that particular curve, ran right into the corner of that triangle, right where all of those seams came together. So gotta watch out for spots like that. I'm going to slow down again. I'm just controlling that speed with my foot pedal, slowing it down so that way I don't stitch just tons of tiny stitches right there, because I'm not going to be able to move as fast with my hands. Okay, now that we got through that tricky spot, the circles are going to get bigger. So I think I'm going to reach about the midpoint, and then I'll rotate, reposition my hands a little bit, and finish off. Sometimes you have to break it up a little bit, and that's just fine. As far as that transition, whenever you stop and reposition, let me kind of talk you through that. I'm going to reach the midpoint of this block, and then I'll stop. So stop with the needle in the down position. If you don't have an automatic needle up, needle down, you can take your hand to the hand wheel and rotate it so that the needle is down. So in that situation, I would just firmly place one hand to make sure it stays on the quilt, and I'd go to the hand wheel with the other hand. Okay, so now I rotate around, making sure I have a nice position. And the one thing that I always make sure to do, I make sure that when I put my hands down, I'm ready to go, I actually am moving. Meaning I'm not sitting there with the needle going up and down in the same spot. I take the stitch. The first couple of stitches are a little slow, and then I build back up to medium speed, but I make sure that I move ever so slightly off that spot that I stopped in, and that enables me to, not basically build up a knot of thread. It also kind of gets me moving. It's something to concentrate and focus on, certainly. Okay, I've got these few little lines right here that can be knocked out. And actually that spat me out, so I'm right here in this center section, and I could just go on ahead and fill this, so I think I'm going to. We're going to be doing stippling on a 1/2 inch scale, so it's a good idea to grab something or look at something that's on a 1/2 inch scale. I like, my pinky finger is about that width, so I kind of look at that and guesstimate, kind of get that width in my brain, and then I start stippling. I'm going to just wiggle, stitch a wiggly line, soft, smooth curves. And I don't want to stitch myself into a corner. I want to make this one big row of the design. I don't really want to get close to that area of intense seam allowance, but I kind of set myself up for it. So I'm going to rotate around and I'm going to stitch pretty slowly for a little while until I can get off of that spot. And I've been thinking about it a little bit more and a little less, distracted talking. I probably wouldn't have set it up that way. But you can see, you can save it. As long as you focus on what you're doing, bring your hands a little closer, slow it down, and you can save it. Okay, so that looks good. Just a nice wiggly random line going in there. No right or wrong way of doing it, that's for sure. Okay, now I can match up with this little line and finish up my echo shell. Again, this is 1/2 inch stippling, so I'm just concentrating on soft curves, about 1/2 inch apart. You want to soften your face as you make these shapes. If you're gritting your teeth in frustration, it can be kind of challenging to stitch something as soft and fluid as this. And it's as simple as just wiggly U-shapes. That wiggly design we've come back to so many times this year. It doesn't have to be intense or complex. We don't have a lot of space to work in here. So you're going to have to use those edges around the block and around the perimeter of your block, around the basket. You're going to have to use those spaces in order to fit this completely, in order to fit it consistently. You can see I stitched beyond that perimeter line. That's okay. I'll end up cutting that off whenever we go to connect our blocks together, and that's just fine. This area will be definitely secure by multiple lines of stitching whenever we bind our blocks together. Okay, so I ended up roughly where I wanted to be. I'm going to stitch that center circle, and being mindful that this area is dense and intense. There's lots of layers of fabric here, and lots of layers of thread. I need to stitch carefully if I want this to, to work out and be nicely placed. So as I stitch around, I'm connecting with the circle before, travel stitching back, then swinging out with the next circle. If you had trouble marking this, it was, of course, because there's so many layers of fabric right here, it was probably a tricky place to mark. I used a marking stencil, a drafting stencil, in order to mark these, and that worked out just fine. Just layering the circles together as you mark them. They don't have to be exactly what was designed in the quilting guide. The trickiest part I'm finding is the travel stitching. Like I'm coming all the way around and then I'm having to travel stitch back in order to reach the spot where the next circle comes out and around, and that's really the area I'm finding the most challenging. But notice how I slowed down. I'm stitching slower, I'm stitching more carefully. That's really the best advice I have, is just stitch it slowly and with patience, and it's going to work out okay. Alright, so that is half of it knocked out. Not every single one of them is perfect. Some of them are pretty ugly. That's okay. Not the end of the world. So here's what this design looked like when it was finished. So my name is Leah Day, and this has been a video for the Building Blocks Quilt Along. Pick up your copy of the Building Blocks quilt pattern and join us as we learn how to piece and free motion quilt 42 beautiful blocks together. You can pick up your pattern at leahday.com. Until next time, let's go quilt!